Welcome back to Audiobooks Quiver, everyone. Today we're going to be exploring The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel. And I've got someone amazing here with me today who could really help us, I think, uncover some of the hidden gems in this book.
Yeah, I'm really excited to kind of delve into this with you. Housel's book, I think, really stood out for me because it takes this, approach to finance that is really from a human perspective. It's not about, crunching the numbers or, any of that. It's about really understanding our own emotions and biases
Yeah.
when it comes to money.
Yeah, I love that. And speaking of human behavior, one of the first things that really struck me when I was reading this was this idea that you don't necessarily have to be a genius to be successful financially.
Right. It's really more about how we behave with money than how smart we are. Housel uses these contrasting stories of Ronald Reed, who was a janitor, who quietly built an $8 million fortune, and Richard Fuscone, who was this Harvard-educated executive who ended up bankrupt. And it really highlights this idea that temperament and discipline can actually outweigh raw intellect when it comes to building wealth.
It's so interesting. It really makes you wonder, is there something about finance that makes it different than other fields? Like, if you think about being a doctor or a scientist, expertise is everything, right?
That's a really interesting question, and I think you're kind of onto something there. In fields like medicine, credentials, and knowledge, those are kind of seen as the ultimate markers of success. But in finance, there's this huge element of psychology involved, and there's even, luck involved, and your ability to kind of control your emotions.
Yeah.
And react to these unpredictable events plays a significant role. And that's why you see these stories of, seemingly ordinary people
Yeah.
who achieve extraordinary financial success.
So it's not just about like knowing all the right formulas. It's really about understanding our own psychology and how that affects our choices when it comes to money.
Exactly. Our personal experiences really shape our financial worldview. And Housel uses this example of John F. Kennedy. Now, Kennedy came from a wealthy family, but he grew up during the Great Depression. And his perspective on financial hardship was completely different from someone who actually experienced poverty firsthand.
Right. And it's not just the Great Depression, right? The book talks about how people's experiences with things like inflation or gas shortages or even, stock market crashes, these events can shape their financial decisions for years to come. For example, someone who lived through hyperinflation might be really wary of bonds, while someone who witnessed like a booming stock market might be much more comfortable taking risks.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It almost creates this generational divide, right, in how people approach money. And it's not just about age, it's about the events, the economic events that shape their formative years.
Yeah. And that kind of brings us to another point that really resonated with me in the book.
Yeah.
This idea of enough.
Yes, the story of Kurt Vonnegut and Joseph Heller at the billionaire's party. Do you remember that one?
Oh, of course.
Heller famously said, "Yes, but I have something he will never have. Enough." It really makes you think about what truly matters.
It does. And it really highlights this idea that knowing when you have enough is crucial for, genuine well-being. There's a sense of contentment that comes with it. And as the book points out, this relentless pursuit of wealth, it can actually lead to some pretty destructive consequences. Housel uses the example of Rajat Gupta, remember, a successful business executive who ended up getting caught in an insider trading scandal and went to prison.
It is a very cautionary tale. It's about how this desire for more can really cloud our judgment and lead us down a dangerous path. I mean, Bernie Madoff's story is another example of that, right? And I think it's a reminder that there's a point where more money stops adding to your happiness or security.
Yeah, it almost becomes an addiction.
Exactly. And speaking of things that grow over time, let's talk about this concept of compounding. Housel compares it to the formation of ice ages, Small, consistent actions over time can have this massive impact.
Right. And he uses Warren Buffett as an example. Even though Buffett hasn't always had the highest annual returns, his wealth has grown exponentially. Thanks to his, decades-long investing career.
Right. And what's really interesting about compounding is that it's counterintuitive. The results aren't immediately apparent, so it's easy to underestimate its power, especially in those early stages. But given enough time, it really can snowball into something extraordinary.
Yeah, and that kind of brings us to this crucial distinction that the book makes between getting wealthy versus staying wealthy.
Yes, and this is where things get really interesting. Housel uses the parallel stories of Jesse Livermore and Victor Niederhofer. Both of them were brilliant investors, but they both ended up losing their fortunes. And it really highlights that even if you're great at making money, keeping it requires a whole different set of skills.
So it's not enough to just ride the waves in the market, right?
Yeah.
You need to develop a strategy for navigating those inevitable storms. So what are some of the traits that help people stay wealthy?
Well, Housel talks about frugality. He talks about having a healthy dose of paranoia, meaning being aware of potential risks and acknowledging the role of luck. You have to kind of shift your mindset from maximizing gains to minimizing losses, which can be much harder than it sounds.
Yeah, it's like the difference between climbing a mountain and then setting up camp at the top. Getting there requires ambition and risk-taking.
Yeah.
But staying there requires prudence and adaptability.
I love that analogy. It perfectly captures the mindset shift that's needed to not only build wealth, but to preserve it as well.
And this is where this concept of tail events comes in. I have to admit, this was a new one for me.
It's a powerful concept. In essence, tail events are these rare occurrences that have a disproportionate impact on the overall outcome. Think of it this way. If you flip a coin 10 times, you'd expect to get heads and tails roughly 5 times each, right? But what if you got heads 9 times out of 10? That would be a tail event.
Okay. I'm starting to see how that applies to investing.
Exactly. A single well-timed investment can make your entire career, and a single catastrophic event can wipe you out, even if you did most things right. The tricky part is, these events are often unpredictable. You can't plan for them specifically, but you need to be aware that they exist.
So how do you prepare for something that you can't predict?
That's where diversification comes in. You want to spread your bets, so to speak, and create a portfolio that can withstand those inevitable surprises. Housel gives the example of Gerald Hines, who was a real estate developer, who built a significant art collection. The value of his collection wasn't driven by the average price of each piece, but by a handful of masterpieces. Those tail-end events.
That's a great example. It shows that you can't just rely on the average performance of your investments. You need to be prepared for the outliers, both good and bad.
Exactly. Tail events remind us that it's not just about maximizing returns. It's also about minimizing the risk of catastrophic loss. It's about building a safety net, not just for your money, but for your overall well-being.
So in a way, it's about being prepared for the unexpected, both good and bad. And it seems like a lot of this boils down to having the right mindset.
Absolutely. And speaking of mindsets, the book has some really interesting insights on saving money. Housel compares it to the concept of energy efficiency.
I love that. So it's not just about, finding new sources of energy, but about reducing our consumption, becoming more efficient with what we already have.
Exactly. Just like reducing energy consumption gives you more energy to work with, saving money gives you more financial resources to achieve your goals. It's such a simple concept.
Yeah.
But so powerful.
And the book emphasizes that saving isn't just for, specific goals, like buying a house or retirement. It's about creating freedom and flexibility and the option to pursue your passions without being tied to a paycheck.
It's about having that buffer that allows you to make choices based on your values and aspirations, rather than feeling limited by financial constraints. That kind of freedom is invaluable.
So many people view saving as a sacrifice. But you're right, it's an investment in your future happiness and freedom.
It's about accumulating options and opportunities. It's about giving yourself the space to say yes to the things that matter most without constantly worrying about the financial implications.
Yeah, that ties in nicely with another concept that resonated with me.
Yeah.
This idea that being reasonable is sometimes more important than being strictly rational.
This is one of my favorite takeaways. Traditional finance often focuses on the mathematically optimal solution, but in the real world, emotions play a huge role in our financial decisions.
And Housel uses a brilliant analogy. I love this. He compares it to fevers. Fevers can be beneficial, right? They help fight infections.
That's right.
But they make us feel awful. So even though it might be rational to let a fever run its course, it's reasonable to take medicine to feel better, even if it might prolong the illness slightly.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance between what makes sense on paper and what feels right emotionally. Sometimes the rational choice might cause us so much anxiety or go against our intuition that we just abandon it altogether.
And that explains why people exhibit these behaviors.
Yeah.
Like home bias, where they favor investments in their own country.
Yeah.
Even when there might be better opportunities elsewhere. Or why they, stick with picking individual stocks, even though statistically, they might get her off with index funds.
Yeah. I've definitely been guilty of that one myself. Sometimes the allure of picking the next big winner is just too strong to resist, even if it might not be the most statistically sound approach.
Well, speaking of things that might not be statistically sound,
Yeah.
Housel also explores this,
Yeah.
seductive nature of pessimism. Why are we so drawn to doom and gloom predictions?
Right.
Even though, statistically, the world is getting better in so many ways.
It's a curious phenomenon, isn't it? I think part of it is that pessimism often sounds more intelligent. It creates this sense of urgency and awareness of risk, as if predicting disaster makes you seem more informed about the complexities of the world.
Yeah. It's easier to craft a compelling narrative around impending doom than to highlight the slow, incremental progress that often characterizes human advancement.
Exactly. And remember what we discussed earlier about how our personal experiences shape our worldview?
Right.
Well, if you've lived through a few recessions or market crashes, it's easy to become jaded and assume that the worst is always just around the corner.
And that pessimism
Yeah.
can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you're constantly expecting the market to crash, you're less likely to invest, which means you miss out on potential gains.
Right. Housel uses the example of peak oil production. Back in 2008, there were all these dire predictions about how we were running out of oil and the world was on the brink of collapse. But those predictions failed to account for human ingenuity. We found new ways to extract oil, and we developed alternative energy sources. Things weren't nearly as dire as the pessimists predicted.
So while it's important to be aware of risks, we shouldn't let pessimism blind us to opportunities. It's about finding that balance between acknowledging the challenges and recognizing the potential for progress.
I think that's a great point and a great place to pause for now. There's a lot more to unpack, but I'm really enjoying this conversation.
Me too, and we'll be back soon with part 2 of our discussion on the psychology of money.
Picking up where we left off last time, let's explore this idea of room for error. It's a concept that really resonated with me, especially given that Housel brings up a rather unexpected source of wisdom, Las Vegas.
Vegas. Really? I wouldn't have thought gambling and responsible finance go hand in hand.
Well, think about professional gamblers, particularly card counters. They're masters at managing risk and understanding probabilities. They know that even with a statistical advantage, things can still go wrong in the short term. That's why they always maintain a bankroll that can withstand those losing streaks.
So in essence, it's about having a financial cushion, a buffer that allows you to ride out those inevitable market fluctuations without panicking and making rash decisions.
Exactly. It's about creating space between what you think will happen and what could happen. That way, even if things don't go your way, you're still in the game, ready to capitalize when the odds shift back in your favor.
It reminds me of Benjamin Graham,
Yeah.
the father of value investing. He talked about the importance of margin of safety, buying assets at a significant discount to their intrinsic value. It's like building in a buffer to protect yourself from unforeseen circumstances.
Absolutely. Graham famously said, "The purpose of the margin of safety is to render the forecast unnecessary." It's brilliant because it takes the pressure off of needing to predict the future perfectly.
So instead of trying to time the market or pick the next hot stock, you're focusing on finding those undervalued opportunities and minimizing that downside risk.
That's the idea. Room for error isn't just about protecting your capital. It's also about giving yourself that mental and emotional space to stay the course, even when the market gets turbulent. And it's that endurance that allows you to benefit from those rare outsized gains that often come after periods of volatility.
It's like having the stamina to stay in the marathon, even when others are dropping out from exhaustion.
I love that. And Housel suggests that we apply this concept not just to our investments, but to other areas of our financial lives as well. For example, instead of viewing market downturns as a punishment, we should think of them as a fee, the price of admission for participating in a market. That offers the potential for higher returns.
It's like paying for a ticket to Disneyland. You wouldn't expect to enjoy all the rides and attractions without paying the entrance fee, right?
Exactly. By reframing volatility as a fee, we can shift our perspective and develop a more resilient mindset. It allows us to ride out those market storms without getting swept away by fear and panic.
Which brings us to another important takeaway from the book, this realization that you and I and every other investor out there, we might all be playing different games.
This is so crucial. We often fall into the trap of comparing ourselves to others, feeling envious of their successes or ashamed of our perceived failures. But what we often overlook is that they might have different goals, different risk tolerances, and different time horizons.
So what might be considered a risky investment for one person could be perfectly reasonable for another. Right. Like a young professional saving for a down payment on a house is going to have a very different investment strategy than a retiree living off their savings.
Precisely. And this is especially important during market bubbles. People get caught up in the frenzy. They see others making money quickly, and they feel pressured to jump on board, even if it doesn't align with their own financial goals.
It's like being caught in a rip current. You see everyone else swimming in a certain direction, and you feel compelled to follow, even if you know it's taking you further from shore.
That's a great analogy. The key takeaway here is to define your own game. Play by your own rules, and make sure your decisions are aligned with your personal circumstances.
You know, this conversation has got me thinking about all the stories we tell ourselves about the world, especially when it comes to money.
Oh, this is where things get really interesting. Housel argues that we all have this incomplete view of the world, so we create narratives to fill in the gaps. The problem is these narratives often lead to blind spots and biases in our decision-making.
It's like trying to assemble a puzzle with some pieces missing. You try to force the pieces you do have to fit, even if it creates a distorted picture.
Exactly. We crave order and predictability, so we cling to stories that make the world feel more understandable. And when it comes to something as complex and emotionally charged as money, those stories can have a huge impact on our choices.
Like those market forecasts that everyone seems so obsessed with, despite their notoriously poor track record. People crave that illusion of control, the idea that we can somehow predict the future.
It's like looking for a crystal ball that will reveal the winning lottery numbers. We want to believe that someone, somewhere, has all the answers, even though deep down we know it's impossible.
And isn't that part of the problem? We try to apply the same level of certainty we see in fields like physics to something as unpredictable as the stock market.
You hit the nail on the head. Housel points out that we often confuse fields of precision, like astrophysics, with fields of uncertainty, like finance. NASA can predict the trajectory of a spacecraft with incredible accuracy of predicting human behavior, which ultimately drives the markets. Is a whole different story.
So we need to be comfortable with a certain degree of uncertainty, especially when it comes to investing. I guess that's where having that room for error we discussed earlier comes in handy.
Absolutely. And this leads to another important point. Smart, well-informed, reasonable people can disagree in finance. There's rarely a single right answer, especially when it comes to personal finance.
That's a relief to hear. It's easy to feel like you're doing something wrong if your approach doesn't align with what everyone else seems to be doing.
Right. Housel emphasizes that it's perfectly okay to have different approaches. People have different goals, different risk tolerances, different time horizons, which naturally lead to different financial philosophies. It's like choosing a travel destination. Some people crave adventure and excitement, while others prefer relaxation and comfort. There's no right or wrong answer. It's about finding what suits you best.
So it's about being self-aware, defining your own values and goals, and making choices that align with them, even if they differ from what others are doing.
Exactly. And to wrap things up, Housel gives us a glimpse into his own personal approach to money in the chapter aptly titled Confessions.
This is where things get really personal, right? He talks about his journey from stock picking to index fund investing, his emphasis on saving and living below his means, and his philosophy on balancing risk and reward. It's refreshing to see someone who writes so eloquently about finance be so transparent about their own decisions.
I agree. It makes the concepts feel more relatable and attainable. Housel emphasizes the importance of finding a strategy that you're comfortable with, one that allows you to stick with it through thick and thin.
And for him, that means prioritizing index funds, maintaining a healthy cash cushion, and focusing on long-term compounding rather than chasing those short-term gains.
Right. It's not about finding the perfect strategy, but about finding one that aligns with your personality, your goals, and your risk tolerance. And as Housel points out, this approach has brought him not only financial success, but also peace of mind.
That's a powerful combination. Financial success without peace of mind is just anxiety with a bigger bank account.
So true, ultimately. It's about aligning your financial decisions with your values and finding a balance that allows you to enjoy the present while planning for the future.
So it sounds like Housel is advocating for this more holistic approach to money, one that goes beyond just, maximizing returns.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. It's about recognizing that money is a tool that can be used to build a life that is both financially secure and personally fulfilling.
And one of the things that really resonated with me was his emphasis on finding that balance between enjoying the present and planning for the future.
Yes. It's about delaying gratification without depriving yourself of the things that bring you joy. It's about making conscious choices that align with your values.
So it's not about, living like a miser, but about spending intentionally and saving for the things that truly matter to you.
Exactly. And that brings us back to the importance of defining enough. It's different for everyone, and it evolves over time as our circumstances and priorities change.
Right. It's about finding that point where more money stops meaningfully adding to your happiness and security. It's about recognizing that true wealth lies in experiences and relationships and purpose.
That's the heart of the psychology of money. It's not just about accumulating wealth, but about using money as a tool to build a life that is rich in all the things that truly matter.
Well, this has been a fantastic conversation. I feel like I have a whole new perspective on money and how it influences our lives. I want to thank you for sharing your insights with us today.
It's been my pleasure. I always enjoy exploring these ideas, and Housel's book is a great starting point for anyone who wants to understand the psychology behind their financial decisions.
And for those of you listening, if you enjoyed this in-depth summary and review of the psychology of money, be sure to like and subscribe to Audiobooks Quiver for more insightful book summaries. We're constantly adding new content to help you expand your knowledge and explore the fascinating world of books. Until next time, happy reading.